Hello, and welcome to CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films. On this episode, the Deliberate Recession. Amidst huge global uncertainty, one thing we can say for sure is that recession is coming, brought on by the lockdowns ordered by governments in order to prevent the spread of a dangerous new coronavirus. The aim of government policy is effectively to stop a considerable amount of economic activity. So if recession is the deliberate result of government policy, what does success look like? How to weigh lives versus livelihoods? And how are we going to get out of this? I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent, and I'll be your guide. And if you like what we're doing, be sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. We have Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist at the World Bank and advisor to past US presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and winner of the Nobel Prize in economics in 2001. We also have Sir Vince Cable, business secretary in the UK's coalition government between 2010 and 2015, and until last year the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Vince is currently a visiting professor at the Institute of Global Affairs at the London School of Economics. Welcome to you both. First of all, I'd like to get a sense from both of you of just how severe the economic crisis we're looking at here is. So to set the scene, let's take a look at this chart produced by Len Kiefer of Freddie Mac, and it shows new weekly unemployment insurance claims in the US. From the 1960s, you can see there that the number of claims in a week varied between 200,000 and 700,000. And that went on for many decades in that band. And then suddenly in the last 2 weeks, as you can see on this chart, there was a huge increase, 10 million claims in just 2 weeks. So Professor Stiglitz, first of all, is that what the start of a depression looks like?
Well, we've never had anything quite like this where it's been so sudden. The estimates are that we already have around 15% unemployment, the highest since the Great Depression, and wouldn't be surprised if we hit 20, 30%. So we're in the area of a depression, not like the Great Depression caused by a failure of aggregate demand, but as you said, the coronavirus, where people don't want to get together to produce or to consume.
So Vince, let me ask you, I mean, Joe just said there that unemployment in the US could hit 25%. That's similar to levels in the Great Depression. Do you think things could get that bad here in the UK?
Well, it's very plausible. I think, the UK has handled this slightly better than the Trump administration in America, but nonetheless, we're going through a rather similar experience. There are bits of the UK economy that are not doing too bad. Obviously, retail food, bits of the logistics system, the utilities are still functioning, construction part of it. The whole software IT sector is doing roaring trade. But yeah, there has been a plummeting of output and a big growth in unemployment. I mean, if we're looking back to the Great Depression, as you know, the UK didn't quite have the same profile. The real damage in the UK was done after the First World War rather than 29-30. But nonetheless, it's a fair model. I think the point I would make is that what really matters is not how far the economy falls in the next few weeks, but how quickly it recovers and in what kind of profile. I mean, it could be a V-shaped, which everybody hopes, but seems implausible to me, a U-shaped, stretched out because of the difficulty of reconnecting supply chains, confidence factors, and so on, a W if the infection comes back, or an L if permanent damage is done, which it may well be. I mean, we could well progress from this to a balance sheet recession of the Japanese kind, and we just never get back to normal.
Okay, so given that this is an unprecedented situation in many regards because it's a deliberate recession brought on by government actions. So following on from that, from what Vince was saying, Joe, what does success look like in this scenario?
So let me correct a point you made. You say brought on by government action. I don't think that's the correct interpretation. The fact is the spreading of the disease would have meant that people would not have wanted to congregate together either for consumption or production. And so what the government has done has been to coordinate the response and therefore to minimize some of the other adverse effects that otherwise would have been felt. But what has been happening in the United States is an attempt to deal with first the health crisis, to make sure the hospitals have adequate resources. So far, the response from the federal government has been an absolute disaster, with the Trump administration unable to get enough tests, masks, protective gear. The United States has a special set of problems because we don't have paid sick leave, so people who are sick are going to work, helping spread the disease. So that's the first thing. The second one is large numbers of vulnerable people. And again, the United States is not in a good position because we don't have a well-functioning system of social protection. And so this is where most of that $2 trillion money went, to provide a basic level of self-protection. And the third is to put us in a position where we can have a recovery. And this goes to what Vincent said, to make sure that we are more likely to have something more like a V or U shape rather than the L shape. And here, what we've done, I'm afraid, is not enough. I think more than likely, unless we do more, it will be more difficult to restart the economy.
Now, I want to play you both something that Donald Trump said on the 24th of March.
America will again and soon be open for business, very soon, a lot sooner than 3 or 4 months that somebody was suggesting. A lot sooner. We cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. We're not going to let the cure be worse than the problem.
Professor Stiglitz, now you may disagree with Trump on many things and question his judgment as you have, but doesn't he have a point about that responsible policymakers have to not only consider saving lives, but also protecting economic activity as well?
The two are not really in conflict. If there is an epidemic going on, people are not going to want to go out and buy goods. They're not going to want to go to work, except for people who, like us, who can do work remotely. So he's totally confused the underlying nature of the problem. That's why I criticized your point of saying the government had done the shutdown. It's the disease that has done the shutdown. And in some countries, government has responded effectively to the disease. Some countries more effective than others. U.S. has not been showing the leadership that we would have hoped.
Well, actually, although, I have the same negative views about Trump as many people, and it was a totally self-serving comment, of course, he's basically right. There has to be a trade-off, and we make that trade-off in other contexts. If we look at NICE, which gives drug approval in the UK, there is a straightforward calculation. It's the cost on one hand, the economic cost, against life saved, not whole life saved, but the number of months that a life is extended, and it's quantified. And we combine the best of medical science with economics. And I think we should do the same here. I think that nobody is seriously questioning the advice of the epidemiologists about the lockdown at the moment. But a point will come at which, if there's a prolonged lockdown resulting in very serious, prolonged poverty and all the costs and indeed the health impacts from that, and what are we trading that off against? Well, it's essentially about extending the lives predominantly of people of my generation. And it's an ethical problem. It's also an economic problem.
There is a cost of people dying, and there's a high cost of people dying unnecessarily. Now, we don't like to put a price tag on it, a dollar value. We say life of inestimable value. But in many areas, environmental regulation, safety, car safety regulation, we do go through an exercise in the value of life. Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is, if more people die from the disease, the cost that we're talking about is in the trillions of dollars. There's been some calculations of these numbers, and they are astounding. So I don't think there's a trade-off. And even if there were a trade-off, if we properly value life at a minimum value, we're doing the right thing by shutting down the economy.
I think in developing countries, the trade-off is quite different. I mean, I'm horrified by the way, say, the Indians are just mechanically applying the Western model, or the Chinese model, actually, causing immense economic damage. It's not clear what the benefits are because their health system is already overwhelmed for most of their population. In most of the poorest countries, there is a very high proportion of very young people, children who are largely immune, it appears, very few frail elderly. So the cost benefit's quite different. And I hate something to say it, but I mean, Trump is making a sensible point.
You have to understand that Trump is, quite frankly, deeply ignorant. He has equivocated over and over again. He didn't want to take early action. Finally took action. Too late. And as a result, many people will die. So in short, there is blood on his hand, and let me emphasize, unnecessary, totally unnecessary. If he had simply looked at what the science had said, he would have acted much earlier. It's that he doesn't understand science, hasn't understood science from the beginning, including climate science, cut the budget for preparedness, dismantled the White House Office of Pandemics, underfunded the CDC. That has left us unprotected and, unfortunately, not the leader of the vax world.
I want to talk about Sweden. They've not gone for a full lockdown there. In other times, both you and Vince Cable would be fans of Swedish economic policy. So have the social democratic Swedes got it terribly wrong here?
We don't know. There are differing circumstances in different countries. We don't know how sensitive this nasty virus is to temperature. We don't know all the determinants. But I would be worried. I think they have not taken enough precautions. This is a matter of risk, a risk trade-off, and the benefits of their playing in the streets versus the downside cost of an epidemic of the kind that we have in New York City. To me, that risk-return trade-off is pretty clear.
So, Professor Stiglitz, I caught up with Ned Phelps, another Nobel Economics laureate, last week and asked him how big the US support package should ultimately be, and this is what he told me.
Oh, we could certainly do another $2 trillion. Done one, why not a second?
So sure. It could actually need to be twice as big as they've currently done.
Yeah, we could do another one just the same size, and then I suppose there'll be a wait and see, and conceivably will be a third one, depending on what the needs are seen to be.
So you're talking there $6 trillion, that's approaching a third of US GDP. That's absolutely huge, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So, Professor Stiglitz, could Professor Phelps be right? Do governments need to think even bigger in terms of these support packages?
So we're going to need substantial more money. How much more? I think what Ned says is right. It's going to have to be a wait and see. We have to be ready to put more money in if the signs are there. And when I say more money, both to help the most vulnerable and then to prevent clogged arteries when the economy comes to restart.
So the European approach, including in the UK, has been very much about spending money to keep people attached to their companies. The US approach has been more about giving people checks. Which do you think is the better approach for getting through this crisis?
I think they're actually complementary, aren't they? I mean, I think the idea of getting cash to people, the very simple, everybody gets $1,000, actually has quite a lot to commend it for people who are out of work and just lost their jobs. You're getting the cash to them immediately. They're not having to go through all the hoops of our universal credit system. So, yeah, I mean, it's a helicopter drop of a kind. And I'm surprised it's come from the Americans under the current administration, but seems to me to make a lot of sense. But equally, if you can, the furlough scheme in the UK also has a lot to commend it because it is keeping that attachment. But I see the two things as complementary rather than competitive.
Ned Phelps, when we spoke to him, also said something quite striking. He said that what the US needs is a dash of corporatism. Here's what he said.
Mussolini was sort of like a puppeteer, controlling the directions of the economy. This is not something that we want in America as a general rule. Corporatism historically has been a disaster for lots of countries, and we don't want to go down that road. Capitalism is 1,000 times better. But now we're in a paradoxical situation in which we've got to save capitalism. And to save capitalism, we're going to need the government to spend some money to prop up failing corporations. And in some cases, I would go farther and say that it'd be perfectly okay for the government to give some money earmarked for some new directions, like researching means of killing off the virus.
But did you ever imagine that you would effectively find yourself in a position of advocating a degree of temporary corporatism to save capitalism? Yeah, to my horror, I find myself okaying temporary corporatism. Yeah, right. Now, Professor Stiglitz, do you feel that that is the right way to summarize what needs to be done to help the economy through this crisis?
Well, what is clear is that we need a government to come save the economy, just like we did in 2008. But in my view, Professor Phelps underestimates the continuing and important role the government plays. The most important innovations have always come from government. The discovery of DNA, those biological discoveries that have enabled us to decode this virus and begin to work on an antiviral and a vaccine. Those were all government enterprises. And to say that's capitalism and distinguish that from corporatism, I think it's just wrong. The most important innovations have always come from government support. And then the private sector is very good doing what I call the last mile research, bringing it to the market. One of the reasons that growth is so much slower in the last 40 years than it was in the years after World War II was this kind of anti-government Reagan, Thatcher attitude that the government is the problem, not the solution. It led to an undermining of public investments in education, technology, infrastructure, and the result of that is lower growth, more inequality. Basically, the point I've been raising in my book, People, Power, and Profits, where I say we need a new kind of capitalism, progressive capitalism, not the unfettered capitalism of Reagan and Thatcher, which has been a disaster for our economy, has not led to the kind of robust growth that was promised.
Do you fear that it might be difficult to wean companies off state support when this is over, with such huge amounts of support packages rolled out?
Yes, and I worry a bit about some of the companies that are taking advantage of it. I mean, I don't mean corruption in a crude way, but all kind of companies I hear who are holding companies which are well endowed with cash, taking advantage of the furlough scheme, for example, Perfectly good companies, on the other hand, excluded on some criteria or other from the loan scheme. Yeah, there are a lot of potentially very bad decisions. If we're talking about the really big companies, I think the innovation which we've seen in the UK, which I think is an attractive one, and I wish we'd done this in the coalition, is taking equity stakes in some of the big companies that have been helped, so that there is some kind of restitution to society.
You know, the most vulnerable group in this pandemic is older people, but younger people are also being forced to make huge economic sacrifices to protect that group.
It's an ethical problem. It's also an economic problem. And we shouldn't be cowardly, I think, about facing that. And particularly people of my age have got to accept that we're being protected.
I suspect you'd agree that we need a kind of new deal on intergenerational economic equity when this is over. But do you think that this crisis is going to get us to that tipping point where we actually achieve that?
Well, I hope so. As you said, there's been an unfair intergenerational deal. And the more I talk to young people, the more I feel they realize this. They're leaving college with a huge level of debt. They're having a hard time getting a good job. Now they have the pandemic. They can't afford to buy houses, given the way the Federal Reserve has kept interest rate low and led to real estate bubbles. And one aspect of this intergenerational fairness is climate. We are leaving to our children an environment which is much more exposed to very significant climate change. More important than the financial debt that we are leaving them is this degraded environment. And so long as we can make our democracy work, their voice will be heard. Now, unfortunately, in some parts of the United States, there's an active campaign of voter suppression to make sure our democracy doesn't work. And that's going to be one of the big elements of the coming elections.
After the global financial crisis, countries had a lot of debt, and there was a policy of austerity, as you know, because the coalition implemented that. Are we going to need more austerity again after this is all over?
Well, there is this big question. I mean, a lot of debt is going to accumulate on public balance sheets and private balance sheets. And we know from the last decade that one of the consequences of that can be to drag countries back into either recession or slow growth. So we clearly need to avoid that. But we are at kind of potentially at unsustainable levels. So what do we do about it?
You know, when UK emerged from World War II, it had a debt to GDP ratio of in excess of 200%. The US emerged from World War II with 135% debt to GDP ratio, far higher than we're likely to emerge from this crisis. But the years after World War II were the fastest period of economic growth because we did not give in to austerity. What we said is we need to grow. And in the United States, we had massive investments in infrastructure, education, technology, and it worked. Government-led. Let me make it very clear to respond to the view of corporatism and too big government. It was government investments in infrastructure, government investments in technology, government investments in education at the federal government level that led to this enormous burst of economic growth that resulted in a relatively short time that 135% of debt GDP ratio coming down to 45%. So the way to get the economy back into sustainable basis is not to kill the economy, which is what austerity does. And it reduces the denominator and actually makes the debt GDP ratio go up. That's what we saw happen in Greece.
Excellent. Thank you so much to our guests, Professor Stiglitz and Sir Vince Cable, for appearing on CoronaNomics. We will be talking to many more top-level thinkers in the weeks ahead to discuss how we can weather the economic hurricane blown up by COVID-19. So please do stay tuned and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And remember, if you like what we're doing, please hit like and share. This has been CoronaNomics, brought to you by Econ Films. Thanks for watching.